Hey guys, I'm here with a review for the last book I read, which is Do No Harm by Henry Marsh. This is a medical memoir of a neurosurgeon, in which he recounts his years in the medical profession. There's no real plot to this book. It comes across a lot more like a series of essays than a singular book with one plot running all the way through, but I still found it quite interesting. I gave this 3 stars overall. The reason I did that was not so much a reflection of the book as it was my own personal taste, but I will get into that later in the video. I will start out with the positives. The one thing I thought Henry Marsh did an especially incredible job of was writing this book in a way that a layperson can understand it. Neurosurgery is obviously a very difficult part of medicine. It requires a lot of training and a lot of advanced specialized training, and it's not something that I think most people have a working knowledge of. I certainly didn't. I came into this book with my only prior knowledge of brain surgery being the 3 seasons I watched of Grey's Anatomy and McDreamy. So, clearly, no knowledge of brain surgery. But I was still able to read this quite easily and understand what he was talking about. I didn't catch every single thing, but I don't think you really needed to. I didn't find myself Googling anything or looking for explanations at all. It was just very clearly stated and described in layperson's terms. And I really think you don't need to have a working knowledge of brain surgery in the slightest going into this book. You can go in knowing absolutely nothing, as I did, and still understand what he was talking about. I just thought that was so fantastically done, because I feel like that's a very easy trap for especially doctors to fall into, which is writing medical things for other doctors. But this was definitely intended more towards the average person instead of a doctor who already knows this. I also found his stories of patients to be very interesting. He clearly cares a lot, and he got very descriptive about what it was like to deal with the patients, how he could help them in ways that weren't just specifically medical in nature. I just found that so fascinating to read about. He also recounts dealing with the hospital as time goes on and dealing with NHS and how the healthcare industry has changed over the years and what that means for him working in a hospital. I'm not British and he is, so I didn't really have a great knowledge of that going in, and I do think having a working knowledge of NHS, or at least a little bit of knowledge about what it is, would have helped with understanding that particular part. If you're from the UK, you would probably appreciate that part a lot more than I did, but I still did enjoy it. And the final positive is that I thought this was very well written. He is a doctor, and sometimes memoirs that are written by people who aren't specifically writers can be a little bit rough to read, just because if they're not necessarily bad, they're often just very bland and very generic. But I thought the writing in this was great. Like, it wasn't anything necessarily to write home about, but it did flow very well, and he did keep me engaged for most of the book. I think the most interesting part of the book for me was how he talked about neurosurgery and how he talked about it as a profession that he wasn't fully in control. Because I think that's something that a lot of people have with their doctors, is that we know they're fallible, but we sort of refuse to see it, and refuse to see it in a medical sense because we have no choice. But he talked a lot about how, especially with brain surgery, he can't control everything. Things go wrong a lot that he has no power over, that isn't him making a mistake. He just does the best he can. He talked about how that colors his interactions with his patients and how that colors the way he performs it. And he talked a lot about his nerves and his struggles with overcoming the stress and like the terror of having disabled a patient permanently, given them brain damage. Because when there's a consequence to brain surgery, it's usually not something small that you can just get over. It ruins the rest of your life. It was really heartbreaking and really terrifying to read that, and after reading this, I just sincerely hope that I don't have to get brain surgery at any point, because I'm not sure I could handle that going in knowing what he's told me about the whole industry. The one warning I have for this book is that it is very graphic. He doesn't gloss over any of the medical procedures if he's cutting into muscle or describing the brain as being like squishing jelly. He does a lot of that. He does a lot of just, it's not gruesome, but it is very specific and very detailed and very long. These aren't occasional descriptions for each patient. He pretty much has at least one surgery that he describes. So if you're at all squeamish, this is probably not the book for you. And my main critique is sort of going in line with that. I'm not squeamish, but because it is so detailed with the specific procedures, I found myself getting quite bored at times. I don't really have much of an interest in neurosurgery specifically. I just sort of picked this up as an interesting memoir, which it was. But the main reason I did give it 3 stars instead of rating it higher, despite thinking it's a great book, was that I'm not that interested in brain surgery. So I found it quite boring when he would go in depth on the specific procedures and surgeries. Which isn't necessarily a critique of the book. That's just my personal taste, and perhaps this was not the book for me and I really shouldn't have picked it up for that reason. But I did think the rest of the book was quite worthwhile when he was discussing his thoughts and his patients and the way he has to deal with the hospital and healthcare. I thought all that made this book very worthwhile for me, even if it was a struggle to read through the at times very long, fairly boring medical descriptions and surgeries. It really did make me want to be more interested in brain surgery, though. I kept reading this wishing that I cared more than I did. I just was not as interested as perhaps the intended audience would be. I think if you're someone who is at all interested in brain surgery, or medicine in general, I would highly recommend this, even if it's just a passing curiosity. I think this book is worth it, because you really don't need to go into this with any prior knowledge to understand what he's talking about. And because it's written more like essays than a single long work, you can pick this up and read it a chapter at a time, or read it out of order even. Or just read a couple of chapters and then put it down and not come back to it without, I think, ruining the reading experience as you would with a novel. So I think that might be a way to pick up this book to give it a try if you're curious, because I do think it's an incredibly worthwhile read, and I am glad I read it and got through it. If you're like me and you're not super interested in brain surgery itself, I would suggest probably giving this one a pass. Even if you're just the slightest bit curious, give it a try. It's really well written. It's a really well done book. I think you would learn a lot even if you didn't get through the entire thing. Let me know down below if you've read this book and what you thought of it if you have. And also let me know of any other interesting medical memoirs, because this is the first one I've ever read and I'm just getting into the genre, and I think it would be interesting to try some more. Even if this one was not 100% my thing, I do think I gained a lot from having read it. As always, thank you so much for watching and commenting, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye!